Angela, a passionate black nurse, entered St. Mary's Hospital with the ideal of saving lives. Just because of her skin color, she endured all kinds of unfair treatment. But who could have imagined that a series of things that followed would completely rewrite her career and bring unprecedented changes to this hospital as well? Hey everyone, welcome to Worldly Whispers. Let's get started. Angela Parker, a highly skilled black nurse, stepped into the gleaming halls of St. Mary's General Hospital, an institution renowned for its medical excellence in an affluent suburban area. Little did she know that she was about to face a series of challenges rooted in deep-seated prejudices. As she entered, the air was thick with the strong smell of disinfectant and an underlying tension that made her stomach churn. When she approached the nurse's station, a sudden hush fell over the area. Conversations among the staff dwindled to whispers, and their eyes darted away from her, as if they were afraid to make any form of contact. Angela, trying to maintain her composure, politely asked a blonde nurse, "Excuse me, I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse. Could you direct me to the head nurse's office?" The blonde nurse looked up, her blue eyes widening slightly for a moment, before a practiced, yet cool, smile spread across her face. "Of course," she replied. "Down the hall, third door on the right." Angela nodded her thanks and made her way down the corridor, acutely aware of the eyes following her every step. The clicking of her sensible shoes echoed in the silence, each step sounding like a thunderclap in the unnaturally quiet space. Just then, a tall, distinguished-looking man in a white coat emerged from a nearby room. His salt and pepper hair and authoritative bearing marked him as a senior doctor. Hoping to make a positive connection, Angela greeted him with a warm smile. "Good morning, doctor. I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse starting today. It's a pleasure to meet you." The doctor, Dr. William Greaves, looked her over with his steel, gray eyes, his expression completely impassive. "Dr. William Greaves," he replied curtly, "I trust you've been properly oriented to our protocols. We maintain very high standards here at St. Mary's. I hope you're prepared to meet them." Before Angela could respond, he brushed past her, leaving her standing alone in the hallway, her outstretched hand slowly falling to her side. This brief interaction left her feeling deflated, but Angela was determined not to let it dampen her spirits. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and knocked on the head nurse's door. As she waited, her mind drifted back to her days in nursing school. Her mother's words echoed in her ears. "Baby girl, you're going to have to fight twice as hard as everyone else. But don't you ever let them see you sweat. You come from a long line of strong women, and you've got that same strength in you." Angela remembered the countless late-night study sessions, the extra hours spent in the lab, and the constant feeling of having to prove herself. She recalled the subtle dismissals from some professors, the raised eyebrows when she aced an exam, and the whispered comments from classmates questioning whether she truly belonged. Despite all these obstacles, Angela had persevered. She graduated at the top of her class, her determination and skill silencing even her harshest critics. Now, standing in the halls of St. Mary's, she drew strength from those memories. She had overcome challenges before, and she was confident she could do so again. The door opened, revealing a middle-aged woman with a stern expression. "Miss Parker, I presume," she said, her tone clipped. "Come in. We have a lot to cover, and I expect you to keep up." As Angela followed the head nurse into the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into more than just a new job. The air in the hospital seemed charged with an undercurrent of tension, like a silent storm brewing beneath the surface of professional smiles and sterile efficiency. The rest of Angela's first day passed in a whirlwind of orientations, introductions, and a mountain of paperwork. As she made her way through the hospital, she couldn't help but notice the subtle ways in which she was excluded. Conversations would drop to a hush as she approached, only to resume in hushed tones once she passed. Her attempts at small talk with fellow nurses were met with polite but distant responses, leaving her feeling like an outsider in what should have been a collaborative environment. By the time her shift ended, Angela was mentally and emotionally exhausted. As she gathered her things from her locker, she overheard two nurses talking in hushed tones around the corner. "Did you see the new hire?" One whispered. "Yeah, I don't know what they were thinking," the other replied. "This isn't exactly the neighborhood for, you know, Angela's hand froze on her locker door, her heart sinking. She had hoped that the initial coolness was just due to first-day jitters, but now the reality of her situation was becoming painfully clear. This wasn't just a new job. It was going to be a daily battle against prejudice and preconceptions. As she left the hospital, the weight of the day pressed down on her shoulders. Angela made her way to the bus stop, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. The excitement she had felt that morning had been replaced by a growing sense of doubt and isolation. Sitting on the hard plastic bench, she pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. After 2 rings, a warm, comforting voice answered. "Hey, baby girl. How was your first day?" At the sound of her mother's voice, Angela felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She took a shaky breath, determined not to break down in public. "It was challenging, Mama," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line before her mother spoke again, her voice filled with understanding and strength. "Angela Marie Parker, you listen to me. You've worked too hard to let anyone make you feel less than. Remember who you are and where you come from. You're not just there for yourself. You're there for every little black girl who dreams of being in those halls one day." Angela closed her eyes, letting her mother's words wash over her. "I know, Mama. It's just, I didn't expect it to be this hard." "Nothing worth doing is ever easy, baby," her mother replied. "But you've got the strength of generations behind you. Hold your head high, do your job better than anyone else, and don't you dare let them see you falter. You hear me?" "Yes, Mama," Angela said, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "I hear you." As she ended the call, Angela noticed a sleek black Mercedes slow down as it passed the bus stop. Through the tinted windows, she caught a glimpse of Dr. Greaves. His eyes locked on her for a moment before the car sped away. Angela squared her shoulders, her mother's words echoing in her mind. She may be facing an uphill battle, but she was far from alone. With the strength of her family behind her and her own determination to prove herself, Angela knew she could weather whatever challenges St. Mary's threw her way. As the bus approached, Angela stood ready to face another day. Little did she know that her presence at St. Mary's was about to set in motion a chain of events that would challenge the very foundations of the hospital's culture, exposing long, hidden prejudices and forcing a reckoning that was long overdue. In the weeks following her arrival at St. Mary's General Hospital, Angela Parker found herself ensnared in a web of escalating hostility and unfair treatment. The initial coolness she had experienced on her first day gradually morphed into a more insidious form of exclusion, one that was both harder to define and impossible to ignore. Dr. William Greaves, in particular, seemed to have made it his personal mission to undermine Angela at every turn. He took a perverse pleasure in nitpicking her work, no matter how meticulously she performed her duties. Each morning, as Angela made her rounds, she would brace herself for the inevitable encounter with Dr. Greaves. "Nurse Parker," he would call out in a tone that dripped with condescension, "I hope you familiarize yourself thoroughly with our protocols. We can't afford any mistakes here." The way he emphasized the word mistakes sent a shiver down her spine, but she would meet his gaze steadily, refusing to show any sign of intimidation. "Of course, Dr. Greaves. I assure you, I'm fully versed in all hospital procedures," she would reply, her voice calm and composed. Dr. Greaves would then raise an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, as if to say, "We'll see about that." This pattern of behavior continued day after day. Angela was consistently assigned the most difficult and undesirable tasks, while her white colleagues were handed relatively straightforward cases with ease. One morning, a fellow nurse approached her with a sickly, sweet smile. "Angela, would you mind taking Mr. Johnson in room 305? He's been a bit challenging today," she asked. Angela knew all too well that challenging was a gross understatement. Mr. Johnson had a reputation for his racist outbursts and had already driven 2 nurses to tears in the past week. But without hesitation, Angela nodded. She was determined to approach every task with professionalism and prove her worth, regardless of the difficulties she might face. As she entered Mr. Johnson's room, Angela braced herself for the inevitable tirade. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Johnson spat as soon as he saw her. "I told him I don't want no colored nurse touching me." Angela took a deep breath, steeling herself against the onslaught of hateful words. "Mr. Johnson, I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressing. I assure you, I'm more than qualified to provide your care, she said, her voice steady. Despite the constant stream of racial slurs and insults that followed, Angela maintained her composure. She carried out her tasks with precision and care, her hands never trembling, as she refused to let Mr. Johnson's bigotry affect the quality of her work. When she finally emerged from the room, Angela found Dr. Greaves waiting in the hallway, a look of feigned concern on his face. "Everything all right in there, Nurse Parker?" "We heard quite a commotion," he said. Angela met his gaze evenly. "Mr. Johnson's vitals are stable, and his dressing has been changed. Is there anything else you need from me?" For a moment, surprise flickered across Dr. Greaves' face, quickly replaced by his usual mask of condescension. "Well, let's hope you can maintain that level of composure with all your patients. We wouldn't want any complaints now, would we?" he said before walking away. Angela couldn't shake the feeling that she had just passed some sort of test, one that she should never have been subjected to in the first place. Throughout the day, Angela was constantly on the go, rushing from one challenging case to another. She had to deal with patients with complex medical conditions, many of whom were also difficult to handle due to their personalities. Despite the overwhelming workload, Angela refused to let her standards slip. She was determined to provide the best possible care to every patient, no matter how difficult the circumstances. However, the constant pressure was taking a toll on her, both physically and emotionally. As she hurried to respond to yet another call light, Angela overheard two of her colleagues whispering nearby. "Can you believe they're letting her handle all these critical cases?" one nurse said, her voice laced with disdain. "It's like they're just waiting for her to mess up." "I know," the other replied. "But you have to admit, it's impressive how she keeps going. I would have cracked by now." Angela felt a mix of anger and hurt wash over her. The realization that her colleagues were not only aware of the unfair treatment, but were actively watching to see if she would fail was almost too much to bear. Despite the hardships, Angela found solace in the memories of her mother's words. "Don't you dare let them see you falter," her mother had said. These words echoed in her mind, giving her the strength to keep going. Each day, as she left the hospital, exhausted but still determined, she would remind herself of her purpose. She was there not just for herself, but for all those who had faced similar discrimination and for those who dreamed of a better future in the healthcare profession. And she was determined to make a difference, no matter how many obstacles were placed in her path. One eventful day at St. Mary's General Hospital, the atmosphere was abuzz with anticipation as news spread of a VIP patient's arrival. The hospital staff was in a flurry of activity, preparing a room with extra care and attention. This patient, Mr. Thomas Edwards, had been involved in a serious skiing accident, resulting in both his arms being broken. Dr. Greaves, with his characteristic air of authority, assigned Angela Parker to handle Mr. Edwards' admission. Angela made her way to room 412, her mind a mix of curiosity and trepidation. As she entered, she saw a middle-aged man lying in bed, his arms encased in casts. Despite his injuries, there was an undeniable air of quiet confidence and authority about him. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," Angela said, approaching the bed with a warm and professional smile. "I'm Nurse Angela Parker, and I'll be taking care of you during your stay." Mr. Edwards looked up at her, his eyes sharp and assessing. "Good morning, Nurse Parker. I appreciate your help. I must say, this skiing accident wasn't exactly part of my plans," he replied, his voice surprisingly strong considering his condition. As Angela began to check his vitals and assess his injuries, she noticed Mr. Edwards watching her intently. Unlike many of the other patients she had encountered, there was no hint of prejudice or disdain in his gaze. Instead, there was a genuine curiosity. "You seem very competent, Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards commented as she adjusted his four. "How long have you been working at St. Mary's?" Angela was taken aback by his sincere interest. "I've been here for a few weeks now, sir," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "It's been quite an experience so far." Mr. Edwards raised an eyebrow at her somewhat guarded response. "I see," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "And how have you found the hospital living up to its prestigious reputation?" Before Angela could answer, Dr. Greaves burst into the room, his demeanor unusually jovial. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves exclaimed, his voice dripping with false warmth. "I trust Nurse Parker has been taking good care of you. We only assign our best staff to our most distinguished patients." Angela fought to keep her expression neutral, knowing full well that Dr. Greaves had never shown such confidence in her abilities before. Mr. Edwards, however, seemed to sense the discrepancy. "Indeed, Dr. Greaves," he replied, his eyes flicking between the doctor and Angela. "Nurse Parker has been exemplary. I was just asking her about her experiences here at St. Mary's." Dr. Greaves' smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Well, I'm sure she'll tell you it's been nothing short of excellent. We pride ourselves on our inclusive and supportive environment here at St. Mary's." Angela felt a surge of anger at Dr. Greaves' blatant hypocrisy, but maintained her professional facade. Mr. Edwards, though, seemed to be seeing through the charade. "Is that so?" he mused, his eyes never leaving Angela's face. "Well, I look forward to experiencing this supportive environment firsthand during my stay." Over the next few days, Angela found herself spending more time in Mr. Edwards' room than with any other patient. Despite his physical discomfort, Mr. Edwards was alert and engaging. He often asked Angela questions about her work, her background, and her experiences at St. Mary's. His interest was refreshingly genuine, and Angela felt a sense of connection that she hadn't experienced with anyone else in the hospital. One afternoon, as Angela was changing Mr. Edwards' bandages, she overheard a conversation outside the room that sent a chill down her spine. "I don't care what Dr. Greaves says," a nurse's voice hissed. "I don't trust that Parker woman with our VIP patient. Who knows what she might do?" "I know," another voice agreed, "but we can't say anything. They'll just accuse us of being racist." Angela's hands trembled slightly as she continued with her task, the weight of the constant suspicion and mistrust bearing down on her. Mr. Edwards, ever observant, noticed her distress. "Is everything all right, Nurse Parker?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. Angela forced a smile. "Of course, Mr. Edwards. Just concentrating on getting these bandages just right." Mr. Edwards was silent for a moment, his eyes studying her face. "You know," he said finally, "I've always believed that a person's true character is revealed not in how they treat their superiors, but in how they treat those they perceive as beneath them." Angela looked up, startled by the pointed nature of his comment. Mr. Edwards held her gaze, a knowing look in his eyes. "I've seen a lot in my time, Nurse Parker, and I can tell you, the view from this bed has been illuminating." Before Angela could respond, Dr. Greaves entered the room, cutting their conversation short. As she left the room, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Edwards was more than just a VIP patient. His words and actions hinted at a deeper understanding of the dynamics at play in St. Mary's. For the first time since she started working there, Angela felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, she thought, someone was finally seeing the truth about the unfair treatment she had been enduring. Little did she know that Mr. Edwards' presence was about to set in motion a series of events that would have a profound impact on the hospital and her own future. The hospital was in a state of high-octane activity as preparations for a crucial emergency operation were underway. Rumors swirled about the importance of this surgery, with several hospital board members and important visitors set to observe. Angela Parker, amidst the chaos, was approached by Dr. Greaves. "Nurse Parker," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "we need you to assist in the emergency operation this afternoon. It's a critical case. I trust you're prepared to handle it." There was a glint in his eye that made Angela suspicious. Such an assignment was usually an honor, but coming from Dr. Greaves, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was an ulterior motive. Nevertheless, she replied steadily, "Of course, Dr. Greaves. I'll be ready." As he walked away, she overheard him muttering to another doctor, "Let's see how she handles the pressure. This should be interesting." The hours leading up to the operation were a blur of intense preparation. Angela threw herself into getting everything in order, double and triple, checking every detail. As she scrubbed in for the surgery, she noticed the skeptical looks from some of the other staff members. But she steeled herself, her mother's words echoing in her mind. "Don't you dare let them see you falter." The operation commenced, and Angela found herself working alongside Dr. Greaves and several senior staff members. The tension in the operating room was palpable, heightened by the knowledge that important observers were watching their every move. Despite the pressure, Angela remained focused. She anticipated the surgeon's needs, handing them instruments with precision. However, As the operation progressed, Angela noticed something that made her heart race. Dr. Greaves, usually so confident, seemed to be hesitating. His hands trembled slightly as he prepared to make a critical incision. In that split second, Angela realized he was about to make a potentially life-threatening mistake. Without a second thought, she spoke up. "Dr. Greaves," she said, her voice clear and firm, "perhaps we should consider approaching from a different angle. The patient's anatomy suggests it might be safer." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Angela. Dr. Greaves looked at her, a mix of surprise and anger flashing across his face. For a moment, she thought he might dismiss her suggestion out of hand. But then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded and adjusted his approach, following her advice. As the operation continued, it became clear that her intervention had likely saved the patient's life. When the surgery concluded successfully, Angela could feel the weight of many eyes upon her. Some looked at her with found respect, while others, including Dr. Greaves, seemed seething with barely contained anger. As they began to clean up, Dr. Greaves turned to Angela. "Nurse Parker, I need to see you in private immediately," he said, his voice low and menacing. Angela followed him out of the operating room, her heart pounding. She knew speaking up had been the right thing to do, but she also feared the consequences. To her surprise, they entered Mr. Edwards' room. Dr. Greaves, too angry to notice or care about the location, rounded on Angela as soon as the door closed. "How dare you question my judgment in there?" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? You're lucky I don't have you fired on the spot for such insubordination." Angela stood her ground. "Dr. Greaves, I was simply doing my job. The patient's safety. Your job is to follow orders, not to think you know better than your superiors." Dr. Greaves interrupted, his voice rising. "This is exactly why people like you don't belong in a prestigious institution like St. Mary's. You're here because of some misguided attempt at diversity, not because you have any real skill or knowledge." Just as Angela was about to respond, a voice cut through the room. "Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards said, his voice filled with a quiet authority, "I believe you've forgotten where you are and who you're speaking to." Both Angela and Dr. Greaves turned, startled, to see Mr. Edwards sitting up in his bed, a look of controlled anger on his face. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves stammered, his face paling as he realized the gravity of his mistake. I didn't realize you were awake. I apologize for disturbing you." "Oh, I'm very much awake, Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards replied, his eyes narrowing. "And I've been awake for quite some time, long enough to observe the disgraceful way you and others in this hospital have been treating Nurse Parker." Angela stood frozen, unable to believe what she was hearing. Mr. Edwards, the quiet patient, was suddenly radiating an aura of power and authority. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves began, his voice trembling slightly, "I assure you, there's been a misunderstanding." "There's been no misunderstanding," Mr. Edwards cut him off sharply. "What I've witnessed during my stay here is a clear pattern of discrimination and harassment, and it ends now." As Mr. Edwards spoke, the realization dawned on both Angela and Dr. Greaves that he was far more than just a VIP patient. Mr. Edwards, his voice resonating with authority, declared that he was the CEO of Healthcare United, one of the largest healthcare conglomerates in the country. His revelation left Dr. Greaves and Angela stunned. The hospital administrator, summoned hastily, entered the room, looking flustered. Mr. Edwards wasted no time in laying out his demands for an immediate overhaul of the hospital's discriminatory practices. He called for a comprehensive investigation into all instances of discrimination, mandatory diversity and inclusion training for every staff member, and a complete revamp of the hiring and promotion processes. Regarding Dr. Greaves, Mr. Edwards was firm. His behavior must be thoroughly investigated. His actions today were not only unprofessional, but discriminatory and potentially dangerous to patient care, he stated. The administrator, realizing the gravity of the situation, nodded numbly, assuring Mr. Edwards that the changes would be implemented without delay. News of Mr. Edwards' identity and his demands spread like wildfire throughout the hospital. The once quiet halls were now abuzz with a mix of fear, anticipation, and hope. Angela, still reeling from the day's events, found herself at the center of attention. Colleagues who had previously ignored or belittled her now approached her, some offering awkward apologies, while others sought her insights on the impending changes. At an emergency staff meeting, Mr. Edwards addressed the gathered crowd. For those who don't know me, I am Thomas Edwards, CEO of Healthcare United. During my stay here as a patient, I witnessed a culture of discrimination and unprofessionalism that has no place in modern healthcare. The treatment of Nurse Angela Parker is a symptom of a systemic problem that we must address, he said, his voice echoing in the auditorium. He then announced that Angela had agreed to take on the role of Chief Diversity Officer at St. Mary's. Angela, taken aback by the announcement, stepped up to the podium. Thank you, Mr. Edwards. To all of you, I want to say that I stand before you not as an adversary, but as a colleague committed to the betterment of St. Mary's. The road ahead will be challenging, but I am determined to work with each of you to create an environment where every staff member feels valued and every patient receives the best possible care, regardless of their background, she said, her voice steady. Her words seemed to strike a chord with many in the room, as some nodded in agreement and others looked thoughtful. In the days and weeks that followed, Angela, alongside Mr. Edwards and the hospital administration, worked tirelessly to implement the promised changes. The mandatory diversity training, initially met with resistance, gradually began to open the eyes of the staff. They started to recognize the deeply rooted biases within the hospital and the importance of creating an inclusive environment. Dr. Greaves, following a thorough investigation, was dismissed from his position. This sent a clear message to everyone in the hospital that discriminatory behavior would not be tolerated. As time passed, the atmosphere at St. Mary's began to shift. There was still tension, as change is never easy, but there was also a palpable sense of hope. Staff members started to collaborate more, and the overall working environment became more positive. A year after the fateful day of Mr. Edwards' intervention, Angela was invited to speak at a national healthcare conference. Standing before a packed auditorium, she shared St. Mary's story of transformation. A year ago, I was a nurse on the verge of giving up. Today, I stand here as living proof that change is possible. One voice, one person, can make a difference, she said, her eyes shining with pride. She detailed the challenges they had faced, the small victories, and the long-term impact of the changes. After the conference, Mr. Edwards, now fully recovered, approached Angela. "You come a long way, Angela. What you've achieved at St. Mary's is remarkable, and it has already inspired other hospitals in the Healthcare United network to follow suit," he said with a warm smile. Angela reflected on her journey, from a nurse facing discrimination to a leader driving change. The work was far from over, but she felt a sense of purpose and determination stronger than ever. As she prepared to return to St. Mary's, she looked forward to continuing the fight for a truly inclusive healthcare system, one step at a time.
If this story touched you, show your support by liking and subscribing. Your encouragement helps us keep sharing memorable stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.